Can you believe it? My neighbor Marla literally cut down my fence like with a chainsaw, just because she wanted access to her garden. I stood there thinking, is this real life? Who even does that in broad daylight without blinking? And yeah, what came after? I couldn't have made it up if I tried. HOA nonsense, neighborhood politics, all of it. You ever had to deal with someone like that, just steamrolling through boundaries like they own the whole block? Let me know where you're watching from. And if your HOA is as wild as mine, you know how some mornings start perfectly and then just explode. That was last Tuesday for me. I'm Mike Wilson, and I'd been living in my little wooden cabin in the suburbs for about 6 months now. Moving out of the city was supposed to be my escape from all the drama and noise. I work as a freelance land survey analyst, so I can work from anywhere with decent internet, and this place seemed perfect. Quiet street, nice neighbors, beautiful trees everywhere. The cabin had belonged to my grandfather before he passed, and living here felt like honoring his memory somehow. He'd always talked about the peace he found in this neighborhood, how it reminded him of simpler times. I should have known it was too good to be true, but honestly, I was just happy to have my own space after years of cramped apartments. The cabin needed some work, but that's half the fun of owning your own place, right? I'd spent the previous month building this gorgeous 6-foot wooden fence around my small garden area. Dark brown stained solid construction. I was actually pretty proud of it. It gave me privacy and made the whole property look more finished, you know? More than that, it felt like something my grandfather would have appreciated. He was always working with his hands building things that lasted. This fence was my way of continuing that tradition of making the place truly mine, while respecting what he'd left behind. Every board I'd placed, every nail I'd hammered felt like a small tribute to him, and the values he'd taught me about taking care of what's yours. So, there I was, Tuesday morning, around 8:30, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee checking emails and getting ready to start my workday. I had this big surveying project due by the end of the week, and I was actually making good progress on it. The morning was peaceful birds chirping, that kind of suburban tranquility I'd been craving for years. Then suddenly I hear this loud buzzing noise. At first I thought maybe someone was doing yard work, which is totally normal for a Tuesday morning. But then the sound got closer and louder, and I realized it was coming from my backyard. I'm not kidding when I say the sound made my blood run cold. It was definitely a chainsaw, and it was definitely on my property. I jumped up from my chair so fast I almost spilled coffee all over my laptop. My heart was already racing as I rushed to the back door, and what I saw when I looked outside still makes me shake my head in disbelief. There was my neighbor standing at my beautiful fence with a running chainsaw, and she'd already cut a massive hole through it. I'm talking about a hole big enough for a person to walk through comfortably. The woman was maybe 50-something, blonde bob haircut, wearing gardening gloves, and acting like this was the most normal thing in the world. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I was on a hidden camera show. This couldn't be real, could it? Someone destroying my fence in broad daylight, like it was their right. I later learned her name was Marla Henderson, and she was the HOA president, but at that moment she was just the crazy lady destroying my property. I stood there for a few seconds, honestly wondering if I was still asleep and having some weird nightmare. But the pile of broken wood at my feet was very real, and so was the sound of that chainsaw still running. I mean, who does that? Who just walks onto someone else's property and starts cutting down their fence? I've heard of neighbor disputes before, but this was like something out of a bad movie. Looking back, I should have called the police immediately, but I was so shocked, I could barely form a coherent thought. Part of me was fighting back what felt like tears. Not just anger, but genuine hurt at seeing something I had built with my own hands destroyed so casually. When Marla saw me standing there, she actually turned off the chainsaw and smiled at me. Smiled like she'd just done me a favor or something. "Oh, good morning, Mike," she said in this cheerful voice that made my skin crawl. "I hope I didn't wake you up. I wanted to get this done early before it got too hot outside." I just stared at her, trying to process what was happening. Did she really think I was going to be okay with this? "You need to understand," she continued. "I need this pathway to access my vegetable garden. Your fence is blocking my family's historic walkway." Historic walkway. I'd been living here for 6 months, and I'd never seen anyone use that area as a walkway. It was just part of my yard, and I had every right to fence it in. Watching her hold a chainsaw while talking like this was normal. I thought I was living in some dark comedy. The whole situation was so absurd I didn't even know how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh, and part of me wanted to scream. Instead of losing my temper, though, I did something that probably saved me a lot of trouble later on. My work as a land surveyor has taught me that documentation is everything, so I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures from multiple angles. It was all I could think to do. My hands were shaking. Marla cutting the fence, the pile of destroyed wood, the hole she'd created. I documented everything. I even took a short video of her standing there with the chainsaw explaining how she needed access to her garden. At the time, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the photos, but something told me I'd need proof of what happened. Marla seemed a little annoyed that I was taking pictures, but she didn't try to stop me. She just kept talking about her historic pathway and how my fence was interfering with decades of family tradition. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that she was completely making this stuff up as she went along. But she said it all with such confidence, like she genuinely believed she had the right to destroy my property. After she finished her little speech, Marla picked up her chainsaw and walked back toward her house like nothing had happened. She didn't apologize, didn't offer to pay for the damage, didn't even seem to understand that what she'd done was wrong. I watched her disappear into her backyard, and I just stood there looking at the destruction. My beautiful fence had a gaping hole in it, and there were wood chips scattered everywhere. I'd spent hours building that section, and she'd destroyed it in minutes. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd stepped into some alternate reality where people could just do whatever they wanted to their neighbor's property. I mean, I knew HOA neighborhoods could be a little intense sometimes, but this was completely insane. Watching her walk away with that smug look on her face, I wondered if I was underestimating my opponent, or if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. I'll be honest with you. My first instinct was to call the police. What Marla did was straight-up property destruction, and I had all the evidence I needed. But then I thought about it and realized that since she was the HOA president, maybe I should try going through the proper channels first. Was I really ready to go against the HOA president? What if this backfired? I'm not a confrontational person by nature, and I figured there had to be some reasonable way to resolve this. Boy, was I wrong about that. I spent the rest of Tuesday researching HOA regulations and the legal history of our area. I pulled up the official property boundaries, got copies of my fence permits from the county office, and put together what I thought was a pretty solid case. I even found the original survey maps that showed exactly where my property line was, and guess what? Marla's historic pathway was completely on my land. There was no easement, no shared access agreement, nothing that would give her any legal right to use that area. Wednesday morning, I filed an official complaint with the HOA board. I included photos, boundary maps, fence permits, and a detailed timeline of what happened. I even included the receipts for the materials I'd used to build the fence, just to show how much money she'd cost me. The whole packet was about 15 pages long, and I thought it was pretty thorough. My voice cracked when I said her name aloud to the office assistant. I was more nervous than I'd expected. I dropped it off at the HOA office and requested a formal hearing to address the situation. The office assistant seemed sympathetic when I explained what happened, and she assured me that the board would review my complaint and schedule a meeting within a week. I left feeling cautiously optimistic. Surely once they saw all the evidence, they'd side with me and make Marla pay for the damage. I mean, the facts were pretty clear, right? She destroyed my property without permission. How hard could this be to resolve? The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center. I showed up early with a folder full of documents and my laptop, ready to present my case professionally. The board had 5 members, but it was pretty obvious from the start that Marla controlled everything. She sat at the head of the table, like some kind of neighborhood queen, and the other 4 members kept looking to her for guidance on every little decision. When my turn came to present, I laid out the facts methodically. I showed them the photos of Marla cutting my fence, the county maps proving the land was mine, and the permits I'd obtained before building. I thought I was being calm and logical, presenting evidence that any reasonable person would find convincing. But as I talked, I could see Marla preparing for her counterattack, and something in her expression told me this wasn't going to go the way I expected. When Marla's turn came, she put on a performance that would have made any soap opera actress jealous. First, she produced this old, wrinkled map that looked like it had been stored in someone's attic for decades. It had no official stamps, no government seals, just some hand-drawn lines and faded writing. She claimed it showed the original property boundaries from 1945 and insisted that my fence was blocking a pathway that her family had used for generations. Then she started crying, actual tears rolling down her face, while talking about her grandmother's vegetable garden and how this pathway was part of her family heritage. She even pulled out a black and white photograph of an elderly woman standing next to some plants, claiming it was her grandmother by the garden in 1945. The whole thing was so over-the-top dramatic that I almost laughed out loud. Part of me almost believed her. That's how convincing she was. I brought official county maps with red stamps and government signatures, and she brought tears and a photo that could have been bought on eBay. But here's the thing that really got to me. The other board members were eating it up. They nodded sympathetically as Marla talked about her poor grandmother and how heartbroken she would be to know that her precious pathway was blocked. One of them actually passed her a tissue, and another one patted her on the shoulder like she was the victim in this situation. I kept waiting for someone to point out that her sob story didn't change the legal facts, but nobody did. When I tried to interject with questions about the authenticity of her map or the legal status of the supposed easement, they seemed annoyed that I was interrupting her emotional testimony. It was like they had already made up their minds before the meeting even started. I began to realize that this wasn't really about law or property rights. It was about politics and who had more allies in the room. After about an hour of back and forth, the board went into a brief private discussion. When they came back, their decision was exactly what I should have expected, but somehow didn't see coming. They announced that they were going to temporarily allow Marla to use the pathway while they researched the historical claims and looked for a mutually beneficial solution. They asked me to understand and sympathize with the special circumstances and to be patient while they worked out the details. Temporarily special circumstances. I sat there thinking, are you kidding me right now? This woman destroyed my property with a chainsaw, and they're rewarding her for it. That's when I realized this wasn't a battle about law, it was about politics. And in politics, whoever has more allies wins. The research they promised to do would probably take months, and in the meantime, Marla would get exactly what she wanted. Walking home in the dark after that meeting, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I walked out into the night without even realizing I'd left my notes behind. I'd done everything right, followed the rules, gathered evidence, presented my case professionally. And it didn't matter at all. Marla had played the victim, shed some crocodile tears, and won. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, wondering if there was something I could have said or done differently. Maybe I should have been more emotional, or maybe I should have brought my own old photos, or maybe I should have just accepted that this was how HOA politics worked. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. If they wanted to play dirty well, I knew how to play too. I just wasn't sure if I had the courage to cross that line. Looking back, I should have known that meeting was just the beginning, not the end. If they thought they could walk all over me, they were about to learn otherwise. After that joke of an HOA meeting, things got worse before they got better. Marla seemed to think the board's decision gave her carte blanche to do whatever she wanted with her pathway. Within a few days, she wasn't just walking through occasionally, she was territorializing the space. I'd look out my window and see her dragging chairs and plant pots into the area like she was setting up some kind of outdoor living room on my property. She even started inviting her friends over to visit the garden, and they'd all tromp through my yard like they owned the place. I'd stopped opening my curtains. I didn't want to see her anymore. I felt completely violated in my own home. You know, every time I heard voices outside, I'd peek through the curtains and see these strangers wandering around my backyard. It was like living in a fishbowl, except the fish were the ones paying the mortgage. I kept telling myself to be patient, that the HOA would eventually see reason, but honestly, I was starting to lose my mind. That's when I met Arthur Peterson, and everything changed. Arthur lived 3 houses down, the kind of neighbor who always seemed to know things before anyone else did. I'd seen him around before. He was one of those people who spent a lot of time sitting on his front porch, watching the world go by with these sharp, observant eyes. He always seemed to know what was happening in the neighborhood before anyone else did. One afternoon, I turned and walked back inside before I said something I'd regret. Letting her see how much it got to me wasn't an option. That's when Arthur walked over and struck up a conversation. "Looks like you're having some trouble with your neighbor," he said with this knowing smile that made me think he'd been watching the whole situation unfold. I ended up telling Arthur the whole story from the chainsaw incident to the ridiculous HOA meeting. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally like he'd heard similar stories before. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you know that pathway has an interesting history?" The way he said it made my ears perk up. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. I told him no, I didn't know anything about the history, and that's when he got this mischievous look in his eyes. "Well," he said, "if you're interested in learning more, I might be able to help you out. I used to work in the county surveyor's office before I retired, and I know where all the old records are kept. Sometimes the past has a way of solving present problems if you know where to look." Some part of me wondered if this was another trap. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something told me I should definitely take him up on his offer. The next Saturday, Arthur took me to the county library, where they keep all the old property records and land use documents. The building was one of those classic old libraries with high ceilings and rows of filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the beginning of time. Arthur seemed to know exactly where everything was, and he showed me how to search through the dusty records and cross-reference different types of documents. We spent about 3 hours going through boxes of paperwork, and I was starting to think we were wasting our time. Then Arthur pulled out this folder marked Property Access Rights Sale, 2003, and said, "I think you're going to find this interesting." Inside was a document that made my heart start racing. It was a record of the access rights to Marla's exact property being sold separately due to the previous owner's tax debt. Apparently, when people couldn't pay their property taxes, the county would sometimes sell off pieces of their land rights to recover the money. Reading through that document, I felt like I'd stumbled onto a gold mine. I wanted to shout, but forced myself to breathe. It wasn't a win yet. The previous owner of Marla's house had died in 2003, and his estate had fallen behind on taxes. To satisfy the debt, the county had auctioned off various rights associated with the property, including access rights to the driveway and that specific pathway area. The rights had been sold to someone whose name I didn't recognize, but the really interesting part was what happened next. According to the records, that person had never actually used or claimed the rights, and after 20 years of non-use, they were set to revert back to the county government. That's when it hit me. If these rights were sold once, that meant they could be sold again. And if nobody bought them when they came up for auction, they'd just sit there as government property. Arthur watched me piece it together and grinned. "Now you're starting to see the bigger picture," he said. "The county holds regular auctions for these kinds of forgotten land rights. Next month's auction is coming up, and I'd be willing to bet that pathway is on the list." Arthur explained that this kind of thing happened more often than people realized. When property owners died or got foreclosed on small pieces of land rights, would sometimes get lost in the shuffle and end up in government hands. Most people didn't even know these auctions existed, so the rights would often sell for practically nothing to investors or just sit there unclaimed. "The funny thing is," Arthur said with a chuckle, "Marla probably has no idea that she doesn't actually own the access rights to her own driveway. She's been using those pathways for years, thinking they came with the house, but legally speaking, they belong to whoever buys them at auction." I leaned back, forcing myself to breathe. It felt like holding a lit match near a powder keg, dangerous, but oddly satisfying. My dad always said, "Never let someone take what's rightfully yours." But did I have the courage to actually use it? The whole idea seemed so crazy, so risky, that I wasn't sure if I was brilliant or insane for even considering it. Holding that old document, I felt like I'd found the key. But did I have the courage to unlock this door? I'm not gonna lie, the idea of bidding on Marla's driveway access rights at a public auction sounded completely insane when Arthur first suggested it. I mean, who does that? Who goes to government auctions to buy pieces of their neighbor's property rights? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Every scenario played in my head, each one ending worse than the last, but doing nothing had cost me more. Marla had destroyed my fence because she thought she could get away with it. She'd manipulated the HOA board with her sob story about family heritage. She was counting on me being too polite, too passive, or too ignorant to fight back effectively. Well, maybe it was time to show her that she'd picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. I spent the following week diving deep into research about land use rights auction procedures and the legal history of our specific area. I'm pretty good at research. It's basically what I do for a living. But this was different. This was personal, and I was determined to understand every angle before making my move. Some nights I barely ate, just scrolled through legal databases like a man possessed. The The more I dug into the records, the more interesting things became. I discovered that Marla's property had what you might call a gap in its legal history. When the previous owner died in 2003, the inheritance process had been messy and complicated. His kids lived in different states and weren't really interested in dealing with the property, so a lot of the paperwork got rushed through probate court. The main house and lot had been sold quickly to settle debts, but smaller pieces, like access rights and pathway easements, had somehow gotten overlooked in the process. He told it like someone who had seen families lose their land just because a signature got misplaced. It was like finding a loophole in the system, except it was completely legal and above board. Meanwhile, Marla was escalating her behavior in ways that actually helped my case. She put up a private garden path sign on the pathway, which was pretty bold considering she didn't actually own it. She sent me nasty letters through the HOA accusing me of obstructing pedestrian rights and threatening to take further action if I didn't remove the rest of my fence. She even started inviting friends and neighbors to come visit the garden through that pathway, turning my backyard into some kind of public thoroughfare. Every weekend there would be groups of people wandering through my property like it was a park. I started eating dinner in the garage. It felt less like a house and more like enemy territory anyway. The ironic thing was, the more she acted like she owned that pathway, the easier it would be for me to prove she was using land without proper rights. I started documenting everything, taking photos of her signs, saving her threatening letters, recording the dates and times when people used the pathway. Arthur and I spent several afternoons going over the auction procedures and making sure I understood exactly what I was getting into. The county held these auctions every few months, usually on a Tuesday afternoon in the courthouse lobby. Most of the attendees were real estate investors looking for deals on foreclosed properties or forgotten land rights. Arthur warned me that I might face competition from other bidders, but he also said that most investors weren't interested in small access rights that didn't come with actual land. They want full properties they can develop or flip, he explained. A pathway easement isn't sexy enough for most of them to bother with. Still, I knew I needed to be prepared for anything. During one of our planning sessions, I finally voiced my biggest fear. What if this backfires? Arthur looked at me with those steady eyes of his and said, "Then we regroup, like old times." It was a strange comfort knowing he had been through neighborhood battles before and survived to tell the tale. You know, I'd heard crazy neighbor revenge stories like this on QA stories as before, but I never thought I'd be living one myself. Those tales where someone finds a legal loophole and uses it to turn the tables, sells on a neighborhood bully. I always wondered if those stories were actually real or just made up for entertainment value. Now I was about to find out firsthand what it felt like to be the main character in one of those situations. The auction was scheduled for the third Tuesday of the month, which gave me about 2 weeks to prepare. I registered as a bidder, gathered all the necessary paperwork, and opened a separate bank account just for this purpose. Arthur agreed to come with me as a witness and for moral support. "You're either going to pull off something brilliant," he told me, "or you're going to learn an expensive lesson about messing with county government. Thanks for the encouragement, Arthur." The night before the auction, I lay awake wondering if I was making a huge mistake. One mistake, and I'd be the guy who lost his job and savings over a garden path. What if Marla had some legal recourse I hadn't considered? What if the county refused to honor the sale for some technical reason? What if I won the auction but couldn't actually enforce my rights? There were so many unknowns, so many ways this could backfire. But then I thought about Marla cutting down my fence with that smug smile on her face. I thought about the HOA board dismissing my evidence and siding with her fake tears. I thought about feeling like a prisoner in my own home while strangers traipsed through my backyard. Maybe I was being reckless, but doing nothing hadn't gotten me anywhere. Sometimes you have to take a risk to change your situation. Would you give up or take the risk if you were me? The night before the auction, I lay awake wondering, would tomorrow be the day I win big or lose everything? Tuesday afternoon finally arrived, and I've got to tell you I was nervous as hell. I'd barely slept the night before, and I must have changed my mind about going through with this plan at least a dozen times. My hands were sweating so badly, I nearly dropped the bidder card. But Arthur showed up at my door right on schedule, wearing this serious expression that somehow made me feel more confident. "You ready for this?" he asked, and I realized that no, I definitely wasn't ready, but I was going to do it anyway. We drove to the county courthouse in relative silence, both of us probably wondering if we were about to witness something brilliant or something completely insane. The courthouse was this imposing brick building downtown, the kind of place where you automatically lower your voice and walk a little more carefully. I'd never been to a government auction before, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Would there be dozens of people bidding against me? Would professional investors show up and drive the price higher than I could afford? The auction took place in the courthouse lobby, which was this grand space with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. There were maybe 20 people scattered around on folding chairs, and honestly, it wasn't the crowd I'd been expecting. Most of them looked like regular folks. A few older guys who might have been contractors, a woman in a business suit taking notes, a couple of people who were probably there out of curiosity. There was a table at the front where the auctioneer sat with stacks of paperwork, and behind him was a board listing all the lots that would be auctioned that day. The whole atmosphere was pretty formal, but also surprisingly casual, if that makes sense. People were chatting quietly among themselves, and there was this underlying feeling that most of them were probably going home empty-handed. I checked in with the registration desk, got my bidder number, 23, and found a seat in the middle section where I could see everything clearly. The auctioneer was this older gentleman with a mustache who looked like he'd been doing this job for decades. He had that rapid-fire speaking style that auctioneers are famous for, but he also paused occasionally to explain things for newcomers like me. Most of the early lots were full properties, houses, vacant land, commercial buildings that had been foreclosed on or abandoned. The bidding on those was more intense, with several people competing and prices climbing into the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. I watched the process carefully, trying to understand the rhythm and the unspoken rules. Some lots got no bids at all and were passed over. Others had multiple bidders who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I kept checking my watch and my paperwork, waiting for lot number 47 to come up. The access rights to 1247 Maple Street, Marla's address, were scheduled to be auctioned about halfway through the session, when the auctioneer finally called out, "Lot number 47, access rights to 1247 Maple Street driveway and garden path." I gripped the edge of my seat so tight my fingers ached. I couldn't let the nerves show, not now. This was it, the moment of truth. The auctioneer explained that these were usage rights only, not ownership of the actual land, and that the starting bid was $50. $50, less than what I'd spend on groceries in a week, and this could potentially solve my entire problem with Marla. I looked around the room to see if anyone else seemed interested, but most people were just sitting there, checking their phones or looking at their notes. What if this wasn't even enforceable? What if I'd misunderstood everything? The auctioneer asked for opening bids, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. I started to wonder if I should wait to see if someone else would bid first, but then I realized that was stupid. If nobody else wanted it, why not just get it for the minimum price? I raised my hand. $50 from bidder 23, the auctioneer announced, and suddenly every eye in the room was on me. I felt like I was under a spotlight, but I tried to look calm and confident, like I knew what I was doing. The auctioneer asked if there were any other bids, scanning the room with his eyes. Nobody moved. He asked again, giving people one more chance to jump in. Still nothing. Then something unexpected happened. Another bidder raised their hand. $75, called out a guy in the back row. My heart sank. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of, but I wasn't going to give up that easily. $100, I called out, my voice cracking slightly from nerves. The room was dead silent as everyone watched this tiny bidding war unfold. The other guy hesitated, then shook his head and sat back down. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 23 for $125. The auctioneer's gavel echoed like a starting gun. Wait, what, had I bid more than I meant to? I looked at Arthur, just nodded once, like a general, approving a battle plan that had worked. For $125, less than my monthly electric bill, I'd just bought control over the entrance to the home of the woman who destroyed my property. This was actually happening. After the auction ended, I had to complete the paperwork and payment process, which was surprisingly straightforward. The county clerk explained that I'd receive official documentation within a few business days, but she gave me a temporary certificate right there on the spot. I just stared at the paper. $125, one signature, total shift of power. It was just a simple piece of paper with an official red stamp, but it was undeniable proof that I now controlled the access rights to Marla's driveway and pathway. Arthur watched me sign the papers and pay the fee, and when we walked outside, he started laughing. "Do you realize what you just did?" he asked. You just turned the tables completely. Marla has been using those pathways for years thinking they were hers, but now they belong to you. Legally, she can't use her own driveway without your permission. The more I thought about it, the more incredible it seemed. I'd gone from being the victim of Marla's fence destruction to holding all the cards in our dispute. Walking back to the car, I felt like I was in some kind of dream. How had this happened? How had a simple property dispute turned into me literally owning my neighbor's access rights? Arthur seemed to read my thoughts. "You just learned the most important lesson about real estate," he said. "Knowledge is power. Most people don't understand how the system works, so they get walked all over by people like Marla who think they can intimidate everyone into submission. But when you actually know the law and you're willing to use it suddenly, the playing field gets a lot more level." He was right, but I also knew that winning the auction was just the first step. Now I had to decide how to use this leverage, and something told me that Marla wasn't going to take this lying down. Arthur looked at me with satisfaction and said something that stuck with me. "You just flipped the board, Mike. Hope you're ready to play." I came in expecting a petty victory. What I got was a war chest. I'll admit it, I was tempted to keep my auction victory a secret for a while, maybe use it as leverage behind the scenes, or save it for the next HOA meeting. But honestly, I was tired of being subtle and diplomatic. Some part of me whispered to stop, to double-check the paperwork one more time, but I'd done that 10 times already. Marla had destroyed my fence in broad daylight, without any regard for my feelings or my property rights. She'd manipulated the HOA board with her fake tears and ridiculous family heritage story. She'd been strutting around my backyard like she owned the place, inviting friends over to tromp through my garden. Subtle wasn't working with this woman, so maybe it was time for a more direct approach. I had the legal high ground now, and it was time to use it. The morning after the auction, I went to the hardware store and bought materials for a small gate. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure that would clearly mark the entrance to my pathway. If Marla wanted to play property rights games, then let's play property rights games. I was done being the victim in this situation. The hardware store clerk, an older man with calloused hands, looked at my materials and asked what I was building. When I told him it was a gate for my property line, he nodded approvingly and said, "Good fences make good neighbors." If only he knew the full story. I started building the gate right at the entrance to Marla's garden pathway, making sure to place it exactly on the boundary line that I now legally controlled. Same hammer, different war. It felt surreal hammering nails and measuring boards on land that had been the source of so much conflict. The morning was crisp and clear, and I found myself actually enjoying the work. There's something therapeutic about building something with your hands, especially when you know it serves a greater purpose. Part of me kept expecting someone to come along and tell me I was making a mistake, that there was some loophole or technicality that would invalidate my auction purchase. But I had the paperwork in my pocket, and Arthur had double-checked everything with his contacts at the county office. This was completely legal and above board, even if it felt like something out of a revenge fantasy. As I worked, I could see Marla's house out of the corner of my eye, and I wondered when she'd notice what I was doing. I didn't have to wait long. Marla appeared around the corner of her house like a storm cloud rolling in. She was wearing gardening clothes and carrying a watering can, probably planning to tend to her precious vegetables when she saw me building a fence across her pathway. The expression on her face was priceless. Confusion, then anger, then this kind of indignant outrage that I was becoming familiar with. She stood there for a moment, probably processing what she was seeing, before marching over with that same aggressive energy she'd had when she cut down my fence. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising with each word. "You have no right to block my pathway." I straightened up from my work and looked at her calmly, trying to channel the confidence Arthur had taught me. "Hello, Marla," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. "I'm installing a gate on my pathway. Here's the county certificate. I bought the control rights to this pathway at a public auction yesterday." I pulled out the official document and held it where she could see the red government stamp. The look on her face was absolutely priceless. Marla grabbed the certificate from my hands and read it with increasing disbelief. She looked down at the paperwork, her jaw trembling for just a second before the mask returned. I watched her face go through about 6 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Confusion, denial, anger, more confusion, and then this pale, sick-looking realization that maybe she was in more trouble than she'd thought. "This is impossible," she sputtered, her voice reaching a pitch that probably alarmed the neighbors. Nobody can buy my pathway. This is my property. I explained to her as patiently as I could that actually, yes, they could buy pathway rights, and that's exactly what had happened. When the previous owner of your house died in 2003, this pathway section was never properly transferred in the inheritance. It became public property and went to auction. I bought it fair and square. Marla stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. You could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to process what this meant for her precious garden access. For the first time since I'd known her, Marla Henderson looked genuinely scared. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. What happened next still makes me shake my head when I think about it. As more neighbors started gathering around to see what the commotion was about, Marla seemed to realize that she was losing control of the situation in a very public way. The neighbor from next door came over, and the retired couple from across the street stopped in their morning walk to watch. Even Arthur appeared on his front porch, probably enjoying the show. I could see other curtains twitching as people peered out their windows. That's when Marla made what might have been the biggest mistake of her entire campaign against me. In her rage and desperation, she grabbed my copy of the auction papers and tore them up right there in front of everyone. "I don't believe this worthless paper," she screamed, throwing the shredded pieces at my feet like confetti. The pieces scattered across the grass like torn-up lies. The whole neighborhood watched as she literally destroyed legal government documents in a fit of childish temper. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear a lawnmower running somewhere in the distance, a dog barking 2 streets over, but nobody in our immediate vicinity made a sound. I just stood there calmly and said, "You can tear up the copy, but the original is stored at the county office. And I have 5 more notarized copies at home." Marla stood there, surrounded by pieces of torn paper, looking like a child who'd just thrown a tantrum and suddenly realized that all the adults were watching. The reality of what she'd just done was sinking in, and it wasn't pretty. I could see the neighbors exchanging glances, and not the kind of glances that were sympathetic to Marla. Someone across the street muttered, "Unreal," while another just shook their head. These were the, "Oh my God, did she really just do that?" kind of looks that told me the tide of public opinion was finally shifting in my favor. From now on, I continued keeping my voice level and professional. "Every time you want to use this pathway, you'll need my permission, or you can walk around through the main street like everyone else." I gestured toward the front of her house where the normal driveway access was located. "Of course, if you'd like to discuss a rental agreement for pathway usage, I'm open to negotiations. I think $75 a month would be fair, considering the convenience factor." "What do you think Marla will do next? Beg or keep fighting?" Marla's face went through the several more color changes before she finally found her voice again. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her tone was different now, less commanding, more desperate. You can't do this to me." But we both knew that I could, and I had. The legal documentation was clear, the purchase was legitimate, and her little tantrum had just made her look unstable. I'd expected satisfaction. What I felt was complicated, a mix of triumph and something darker. Arthur walked over from his porch with this satisfied smile on his face. "Marla," he said gently, "maybe it's time to think about compromise instead of conflict. Mike seems willing to work out a reasonable arrangement." The other neighbors started drifting away, probably eager to spread the news about this latest development in our ongoing drama. Marla looked around at the dispersing crowd, then back at me standing next to my new gate, and I could see the exact moment when she realized that her position had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the HOA president bullying a newcomer. She was a woman who needed something from someone she'd wronged. The gate wasn't just wood, it was the first wall she couldn't talk her way through. After our very public confrontation about the pathway rights, Marla disappeared into her house for the rest of the day. I figured she was probably calling lawyers, researching property law, or maybe just having a good cry about how her little power trip had backfired so spectacularly. To be honest, I wasn't sure what my next move should be either. I had the legal upper hand now, but I wasn't interested in being a vindictive neighbor forever. We were neighbors, not enemies. So, how did it come to this? I just wanted the harassment to stop, and my property to be respected. Part of me was tempted to really stick it to her, charge outrageous fees for pathway access, or maybe even block the path entirely just to prove a point. But that would make me just as bad as she was, wouldn't it? I spent the evening thinking about what kind of neighbor I actually wanted to be. 2 days later, Marla knocked on my front door. No clipboard, no smug smile. Just an exhausted woman holding nothing but regret. She looked tired and defeated, like someone who'd spent 48 hours coming to terms with a new reality she didn't like very much. "Mike," she said, and her voice was different. No more commanding tone, no more righteous indignation, just the voice of someone who needed to negotiate. "Can we talk about this pathway situation? I think we got off on the wrong foot." Got off on the wrong foot? I wanted to laugh at the understatement, but I could see that it was taking a lot for her to swallow her pride and come to my door. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Would you like some coffee?" She nodded gratefully, and we sat down at my kitchen table like two adults trying to solve a problem. It was weird how normal it felt, considering everything that had happened between us. I proposed a pathway rental agreement with what I thought were pretty reasonable terms. $75 a month for unlimited access during reasonable hours, basically dawn to dusk. She had to maintain the pathway's cleanliness and couldn't place any personal items without my permission. For a second, I imagined charging her double, but that's not who I wanted to be. It wasn't a friendship exactly, but it was a business arrangement that would give her what she needed while ensuring that my property rights were respected. Marla read through the simple contract I'd written up, and I could see her weighing her options. She could try to fight this legally, but that would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. She could try to rally the HOA board again, but after her public meltdown, her credibility was pretty much shot. Or she could accept that she'd lost this battle and try to salvage something from the situation. She signed the contract. Not happily, but she signed it, and we both initialed all the pages like responsible adults. There was no handshake, just quiet acceptance. "Oh, and Marla," I said as she was getting ready to leave. "Did you know that old fence you cut down? I turned it into some beautiful garden planters. Thanks for giving me the idea." What she destroyed became something new. Maybe that's the real revenge. I wasn't trying to be mean, but I couldn't resist pointing out the transformation. She managed a weak smile and said something about being glad it worked out, but I could tell she was just eager to get out of there. For the next couple of weeks, everything was surprisingly normal. Marla paid her monthly rent on time and kept the pathway clean according to our agreement. I'd occasionally see her out there early in the morning, sweeping up leaves or pulling weeds, looking nothing like the imperious HOA president who'd cut down my fence with a chainsaw. She kept to herself mostly, and the stream of visitors through my backyard stopped completely. She wasn't a villain anymore. Just a woman who lost and learned. But then Arthur came over one afternoon with this meaningful smile that I was beginning to recognize, and I had a feeling our neighborhood drama wasn't quite over yet. "Do you want to know why I knew so much about that auction?" he asked, settling into the chair on my front porch. "Funny thing about property rights, sometimes you have to own the long game." Something in his tone told me I was about to learn something very interesting about my helpful neighbor. Arthur revealed the biggest surprise of all. He'd been the one who bought most of the public land rights around our entire neighborhood at previous auctions. He explained that he'd been watching Marla terrorize various neighbors for years, and he'd been quietly collecting legal ammunition to use against her when the time was right. "I've been buying up these forgotten land pieces every time they come up for auction," he said with a grin. He'd been playing a much longer game than I'd realized, and my conflict with Marla had been the perfect opportunity to start using his collection of property rights strategically. The really incredible part was what Arthur decided to do with all his accumulated land rights. Instead of using them for revenge or profit, he announced at the next HOA meeting that he was donating them all to the community with one important condition. The HOA had to adopt new transparency rules and fair conflict resolution procedures. No more secret decisions, no more favoritism, and definitely no more ignoring evidence in favor of dramatic sob stories. When Arthur made his announcement, Marla officially lost all her remaining power and influence. 3 months later, I was sitting on my front porch with Arthur watching our peaceful neighborhood go about its evening routine. Marla still lived next door, and she still paid her pathway rent every month, but she'd become just another resident instead of the neighborhood dictator. She'd even started saying hello when we passed each other, which was more civility than I'd expected after everything that happened. "I learned something important through all this," I told Arthur as we watched the sunset. "Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't avoiding them or fighting them directly. It's understanding the rules better than they do." Arthur nodded and raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. "Patience and knowledge beat arrogance every time," he said. "Most bullies count on their victims being too polite, too ignorant, or too intimidated to fight back effectively. But when you actually know what you're doing and you're willing to use the system properly, suddenly the playing field gets a lot more level. Every morning now, I drink my coffee and look out my window at the pathway where this whole drama started. I see Marla carefully maintaining the area according to our contract. No more arrogance, just a woman who learned a hard lesson about respecting other people's property. Arthur stops by occasionally to share coffee and stories, and I've become something of a local legend. The guy who bought his neighbor's driveway to win a fence dispute. People still ask me about it, and I always tell them the same thing. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or lawyers, but from understanding the game better than your opponent and being willing to play it when necessary. And if you think this story is too crazy to be true, welcome to suburban HOA life, my friend. Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. But hey, if this story hit home or made you laugh or just reminded you of that one neighbor, we've probably got more in common than I thought. Go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment, or subscribe if you're into this kind of chaos. And if you want to help keep QA stories going, you can tap the little thanks button down below. Totally up to you. Either way, I appreciate you being here. Catch y'all next time.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.